hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain innate.
All right, welcome back to the next edition of BC Law's Just Law podcast. I'm Tom Blakely here with Jim Fiore. We're joined today by Professors Daniel Lyons and Kevin Powers. Daniel Lyons is a professor at Boston College Law School, specializing in property, telecommunications, and internet law, as well as administrative law. Before joining BC Law, Lyons practiced at the firm of Munger, Tolles & Olson in L.A. He also clerked for Judge Cynthia Holcomb Hall of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. He received his bachelor's degree from Harvard College and his J.D. from Harvard Law School. Lyons has testified before Congress and state legislators and has participated in numerous proceedings at the FCC. His work has appeared in legal journals such as the Emory Law Journal and the Popular Press, including Forbes Magazine, U.S. News & World Report, and the Wall Street Journal. Kevin Powers is the founder and director of the Master of Science in Cybersecurity Policy and Governance program at Boston College and assistant professor of practice at Boston College Law School. Along with his teaching at Boston College, Kevin is a cybersecurity research affiliate at the MIT Sloan School of Management, and he has taught courses at the U.S. Naval Academy, where he was also the deputy general counsel to the superintendent. There were 25 years of combined cybersecurity, data privacy, business, law enforcement, military, national security, higher education, and teaching experience. He has worked as an analyst and attorney for the U.S. Department of Justice, the Navy, the U.S. Department of Defense, law firms in Boston and Washington, and the general counsel for a software company. Today we're going to be talking about the Twitter files, which has been a story in the news which has attracted considerable attention, congressional testimony, questions about what's going on behind the scenes at the big tech companies. And so we want to talk about some of the legal and policy and big picture dimensions of the topic. Well, gentlemen, thank you both for joining us. Professor Lyons, I wanted to go to you first and just ask broadly, what are the Twitter files and what was uncovered in there?
Yeah, so the Twitter files were a series of documents that were released by Elon Musk shortly after his takeover of Twitter, or earlier this year, last year?
I think it was December.
Yeah,
Late
so,
2022.
I lose track, right? Yeah, so when one of the motivating factors for Elon Musk to put up a bid for Twitter was a concern that the existing management under Jack Dorsey was moderating content in a way that created an unlevel playing field for political content, that they were exercising the moderator's prerogative disproportionately in ways that were downplaying conservative viewpoints. And so the purported purpose of the Twitter files was to sort of bring the receipts. Now that Musk had taken over the company, he was going to provide back of it. So there was a series of data dumps that Musk gave to specific journalists involved in this area, Matt Taibbi and Michael Schellenberger and several others, each of which focused on a specific aspect of Twitter's content management practices in the period before the takeover. The big sort of splashy one was the very first revelation, which was about how Twitter handled the suppression of the New York Post story about Hunter Biden's laptop in the days leading up to the 2020 election.
And so, Professor Powers, what was uncovered in the Twitter files concerning kind of the relationship between the FBI and the intelligence agencies at Twitter?
All right, speaking in general terms, what was uncovered is an alleged, when you step back, is that the FBI was not really working with Twitter, but was asking them, one, to look into information, focus on misinformation, and then asking them to pull such information down. One of the splashes, to use Dan's phrase there, was that the FBI was allegedly paying Twitter money to do this. And there was a question there is like, hey, wait a minute, is the FBI now paying companies to pull down information that they don't want to be in the public domain? The FBI came back and said, like, well, we make these requests and sometimes we pay companies because they're doing this work and they need to be compensated to do so. So that was one of the big issues that came out of the Twitter files, along with a bunch of other ones I'm sure we're going to be discussing.
Yeah. And so does this raise like a privacy concern? And I guess this could be for either of you, but like what privacy issues are raised with this issue?
Well, I'll take that first. The first one is they're releasing private information of their employees, okay? And you step back, so there's personally identifiable information. So Twitter, we're just going to use the Europeans General Data Protection Regulation as an example, because that applies to them. Arguably, and in fact, they release private information. So my name, Kevin Powers, that's considered personal information, the disclosure of which, if I give it over to you and you're a company like Twitter and you release that, or there's a data breach, someone steals it, you have to contact the supervisory authority that applies to you and let them know there's been a data breach. So you step back here, when they released all that information, they created their own data breach, arguably, and they could be in trouble with the regulators on that.
And is that just under the GDPR, or is that also? Yeah, so because
I was using the GDPR as a general example, no pun intended, as a general example. But yeah, that could be impacting, California citizens, depending there. And then you have to look at the, I think there's right now 6 state privacy laws, but the big player in here would be the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC. They would look at the practices. Again, you have personally identifiable information. You have to protect it. There's standards in place, and instead you are releasing it to the general public.
Yeah.
Professor Lyons, I want to ask you, why might Elon Musk, who's the new owner of Twitter, turn over this information? It's people call it select information to select journalists, Matt Taibbi, Barry Weiss, and others. Some have criticized the decision to provide certain files to just these reporters, independent reporters, primarily. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I think the cynical explanation, right, is to sort of back up the narrative that he was pushing before his takeover of Twitter, which was that there in fact is content moderation policies in place at the platform that were tilting against conservative viewpoints. There's been, as you sort of hinted at, a tremendous amount of pushback from what Musk has released, in that it, particularly from Jack Dorsey and some of the former management who were implicated in this, right? Suggesting that you're only getting one side of the story and asking for greater disclosure. And to be fair, the academic community on this question is sort of split as well, right? You can always point to high-profile instances of suppression of conservative viewpoints, but and the Hunter Biden laptop story is a classic example, right? But on the other hand, you look at the list of topics that are trending or material that's trending on any given day, right, on Facebook, right? Ben Shapiro's and Daily Wire stuff tends to be in the top 10, right? So I would say the evidence out there is mixed. So I think one of the reasons why this drop happens the way it does is kind of shape the discourse and highlight there's at least some there. How much, we don't know yet.
Sure. I want to follow up on Hunter Biden's laptop in a moment, but I want to ask you, Professor Powers, so in these files, it was revealed that the FBI was asking Twitter to provide you mentioned a privacy issue, another privacy issue, provide information about U.S. users, oftentimes small, seemingly unremarkable accounts. Is that not a privacy issue? Is it not perhaps warrantless surveillance on, U.S. users, sort of but for the fact the old Twitter regime was sort of willingly handing that data over? What was going on with some of that?
Well, if you're the FBI, you can ask, you can say no, and then you can seek a subpoena. And in this case, they asked, and Twitter gave the information over. That happens a lot. Where they go out to different companies, they're investigating criminal issues, and they'll ask. They don't necessarily start with a subpoena, and they'll just ask, "Hey, we have this case going on. We're wondering if we could have XYZ data." What happened here is they asked, and they gave the information over. Now, stepping back from that as a citizen, you're looking like, well, what's going on here? Like we have this private entity, that says it's not working with the government, but it seems based on like how Dan explained it, you look at some of these emails, but not all of them. So in a box, it looks like that the FBI is working, hand on glove with Twitter to suppress information. There's a bigger story here, but we don't have all that information because it hasn't been released. Sure. And then again, it's a private company, right? So you step back, and I'm just going to throw out a piece here, with the privacy aspect of it, but there's also the shareholders aspect of it, and then there's also the business side of the house. This type of information shouldn't be coming out from a business just throwing it out there on a public social media platform for all to see. And then the information they're giving out is bit by bit. Sure. I'm interested where the regulators are going to go on this. Both in the United States and internationally.
Professor Lyons, I want to follow up with you. So the saga of Hunter Biden's laptop in 2020 is sort of a central chapter of the story of the Twitter files. It appears to show that Twitter essentially upon word from the intel agencies that story was a hoax. This gets a little complicated. In 2020, banned the story from the site. There's this, incident of the New York Post, I believe, having their account essentially jammed up, trying to report on that, on what was ultimately a false rumor of the report that it was disinformation, that it was false. Could you explain, number one, what was happening with Hunter Biden and the Twitter files, and then number two, in a time where there's vigorous debate about things like Section 230 and content moderation generally. Is this a normal way for these platforms to operate and engage in content moderation, where essentially the government is asking the platforms to jump and the platforms ask how high?
Yeah, so a few different pieces of that, right? So what was the story? The story basically involved a New York Post report about material that purportedly was on Hunter Biden's laptop that a tech found when he was doing some repair work on it that implicated Biden, Jr., Hunter Biden, in some pretty bad stuff. And so when the Post went public with this story, both Facebook and Twitter took steps to limit or eliminate the promotion of that story on their platforms. In the case of Twitter, the argument was it violates Twitter's ostensibly neutral policy against disseminating material that was produced as a result of a hack. Right, the idea that this tech who was accessing the information should not have gotten it and released it to the Post the way that he did. So if Hunter Biden was hacked, then this violates our policy against hacking. The Twitter files show that decision was made at sort of a mid-level in the Twitter hierarchy. Jack Dorsey, the then head of Twitter, was not involved. And then upon review, when Twitter got a bunch of pushback about their decision, the company admitted it was a mistake. They shouldn't have done that. That's not terribly surprising, right? You have a company that is processing 1 billion tweets a day. And they're trying to assess them compared to a long slew of rules about what is and is not appropriate on their platform. So the expectation that they're going to get it right 100% of the time is fair. Like, you're going to get a lot of false positives, a lot of false negatives. And most of those we don't know. No, the challenge here is when you end up with, in this case, false positive that has significant implications, right? The more high profile the story is, the more likely the effects of that false positive decision making is going to be felt throughout the population.
Sure. Professor Powers, I want to go to you. So, revelations such as these, that there was essentially this secret program run by the FBI and the OGA, other government agencies, basically the CIA, that was basically acquiring covertly information on users, telling the platforms what speech to ban or shadow ban, there's this term that's used. Seems like a pretty big scandal, and instead, of course, like many things today, it's politicized, where you've got the right saying this is censorship, this is all of these things. You've got people on the left, like Democrats like Stacey Plaskett, who during the hearings said that these are so-called journalists discrediting the reporting. What's going on there in Washington when it comes to interpretations of what's happened here?
That's a loaded question. I think, step back again. I think what we really need here is, like, there's a lot you just put out there,
Sure.
right? I think you actually need to have. I would recommend an inspector general's investigation into this, because you have, like you clearly stated, if Congress is going to investigate this, it's going to be politicized. You're going to have people on the left saying one thing, all is well, and then on the right saying, no, this is anarchy. There's a third state that's taking us out, and they're not following the rules. I really would like to see a neutral, which is tough to get, right? But an inspector general investigation to see what really happened, and then go from there. Because right now we're just getting, bits and pieces from Twitter, okay, and then we're getting, whatever snapshots that are out there, and people yelling at each other in congressional hearings, and nothing's getting done, and we're not getting to the bottom of this, which is very problematic, because it causes us as citizens to have angst, and now we no longer trust, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We don't trust the CIA. We don't trust the Department of Defense. And that's a problem, because you start chipping away at the government, and then, as they like to say on both sides, democracy then fall.
Yep. And then as a follow-up to that, where, we have these investigations and potential future regulations, as social media becomes more ingrained in society and becomes the de facto town square where, information ideas are expressed and exchanged, you kind of need that to be able to, partake in that civil discourse. Is it plausible that like this will lead to some future government regulation where there's more of a like involvement by the government in regulating these tech companies, where it's more of a partnership, and they will just have, instead of it being kind of more discreet as it was with the Twitter files that are coming out, but more like open, and they're just gonna. You think there will be a call to just have more open government regulation of social media?
I doubt it. One reason is because Congress can't, pass any legislation right now, and they talk about, they can't even get a privacy law in place right now. They've been trying to do this for the past 10 years, and they haven't. And I think the next piece too is, the First Amendment. It's freedom of speech. No one's want to touch that third rail and say, guess what? The government's going to start moderating and telling you what you can say and what you can't say. So you said that's, the town hall. It's a public forum.
Yep.
Well, you have a right, First Amendment right to certain levels of speech, and I don't think you're going to have regulations dictating what people can say or not say on, different social media.
Yeah, and I think just to amplify on that, right? There's a huge difference between a publicly owned town square and a privately owned social media platform. It's not just that the First Amendment applies to the government and not to private actors, but also that the private actors themselves are protected by the First Amendment. So Twitter and Facebook have a First Amendment right of editorial control that defends their ability to decide what content they want to put on the platform, what content they don't, how they amplify it. Government attempts to regulate that, forcing social media platforms to include content that they would otherwise block, or regulating the way in which information is presented, is a huge First Amendment problem, right? So when you think about this, the question of speaking on social media platforms, we think about the users, but I think it's important to recognize the platforms themselves have a significant First Amendment right that's implicated anytime we start going down that regulatory path.
Yeah.
Mr. Lyons, I want to ask you, so what does this show us, if anything, about how these platforms are run? It seems like a lot of people today, it's conservatives, maybe years ago during the Bush administration, it would tend to be U.S. liberals concerned about, the Patriot Act, the excesses of, the intel agencies. But, today the right, talks about you're censoring us, you're shadow banning us, big tech is biased. And, oftentimes I think some of those people can be characterized as sort of like the tinfoil hat crowd. And then all this comes out and it's like, oh, wait a minute, they kind of were doing a lot of these things. Is this indicative of typical content moderation conduct at the tech companies? In other words, if you looked under this is just Twitter, but if I looked under the hood at Meta, at these other companies, do you assess that things like this are the norm, or what does this say?
So I'll say, unless you're like 8chan, right, some like complete cesspool where anything goes, every social media platform has content moderation rules, and they do for a reason, right? The reason is because they're interested in drawing users to the site and keeping users on the site. And they do that by making sure that they give users content they want to see and not content they don't want to see, right? So every social media platform is making content-based decisions. So they draw lines in different areas, right? So Facebook has a no pornography policy. Twitter will allow pornography, but put it behind a warning screen, so you get clicked through before you're subjected to it. And that's important because I think each of these is playing to a slightly different audience. They're competing against one another to figure out what the optimal content moderation scheme would be, and it might differ based depending on the segment of the American population, the world population that they're going for. So decisions are going to be content moderation decisions are sort of inherent in a social media platform that isn't a complete cesspool. The question then becomes sort of how do our biases affect those decisions, right? The argument from the right has been that the vast majority of employees at most of these social media companies are Democratic leaning and Democratic donors. And so at the margin that their decisions are going to favor left of center viewpoints and disfavor right of center viewpoints, even if it's subconsciously. I don't know how much truth there is to that. The Twitter files suggest there's some smoke there, right? But like I said, there's definitely data on the other side. But there's a fantastic law review article from 2012, I want to say. It's called "They Saw a Protest." The studiers used some footage of the Westboro Baptist Church protesting outside some military facility, but the content itself was completely devoid of any context. Then they brought in two control groups. One was self-identified as right of center, one was self-identified as left of center. And then they told half of each control group this was a protest outside an abortion facility, and the other half that it was a protest outside of a military recruitment center protesting the don't ask, don't tell policy. And it turns out that everybody's view of the footage depended on their political priors and what they thought the political persuasions of the protest were, right? The more it aligned with your views, the more you thought, oh, what's going on here is okay. The more it was opposite, it was like, not. So there's a lot of tribalism at the subconscious level. That's what the article showed, and the concern is that when you have a disproportionately left of center moderation group, that at the margin, that bias could feed in.
So a follow-up on that, and it sort of segues into my next question, which is for both of you. But following up on that, I think the obvious broader context here is, looking at 2016 and that election and concerns about, foreign governments, misinformation, things like that, and the government's response and some of what we've come to find was going on here. One of the big problems with the tech companies that's sort of evident is, as you said, there's so much content that's going back and forth. You can't possibly police every single thing. And here, the government steps in and seems to assist with that post-2016 is kind of what you find in the Twitter files. Do you believe that the tech companies are, willing to take the help? In other words, outsource some of those decisions to the government, to experts, to other people to say, hey, take this down, don't take that down, so that they themselves don't have to go through and try to make some of those hard decisions? Or is this, you'll hear the company line, well, we're working with our partners and we're, et cetera. How do you feel that plays out behind the scenes in terms of taking that assistance from the government?
So from a legal perspective, I think as Professor Powers pointed out earlier, right, the government can ask, but as long as they're not compelling, right, there's no sort of quid pro quo involved. It remains sort of legally the editorial decision of the content provider. I'm not surprised that someone like Twitter or Facebook would want to at least have that input as part of their decision-making matrix, because they're leveraging the information that the intelligence community has gathered, right? But the fact that it's ultimately their decision helps them decide how to filter that information and whether to take it with a grain of salt. I don't know if you have more thoughts on that.
No, it gives you coverage, right? So if you're working with the FBI or law enforcement and they're telling you, hey, we're looking at some of this information, it looks like it's coming from Russia or wherever, be careful. Well, if you make your decisions and it's based on something the government, law enforcement is telling you, you have that coverage for the reason you did it. Hey, the FBI came to us and said, Russia, all this information is coming from Russia. It's misinformation. Take a look at it, and that helps with your standards. It changes the game if they came in and said, pull it down.
Sure.
Well, and you're always worried about, we talk about false positives, false negatives, right? You're always worried about the fact that it may be right? And this is not unique to social media platforms, right? You go back to the post 9/11 era, when the Bush administration asked Verizon and AT&T to, open up their networks and allow the government to do some obviously illegal stuff to surveil, right? The administration was approaching them and said, hey, America's under attack, right? There's some real national security problems. We need you to step up and do this for your country. It was really hard for them to say no. And really hard, especially if the next 9/11 happens in the wake of that, right? And it can be blamed on the company not cooperating with the government to prevent it from happening. Sure. So those calculations are weighing in the background as well.
So going off of that, this is sort of a question for both of you. Professor Powers, I can go to you first. So a central term in our discourse the last few years has become disinformation, misinformation, these terms that are used so frequently now. And I could be wrong, but I myself, I'm not convinced that most Americans could give you a clear definition of what those terms means. I think everyone understands, obviously, what false information is. We talk in the law about true threats, violent speech and things like that. But misinformation, disinformation seem to have a lower bar than, falsehoods, information that's libelous, things that we're familiar with. And yet it seems like a whole lot of speech is being banned in the name of limiting misinformation and disinformation. What do those terms mean, and how do they figure into the future of these issues with big tech?
Let me get my dictionary out. When I think of disinformation, misinformation, I'm thinking it on the military side of the house. So you're having a campaign. So, whether you have your adversaries, you want to get information out there really to undercut the government or undercut their military. that's what I'm thinking. But when I look at the social media piece, I think those are buzzwords used that if you don't agree with a certain type of speech, you say that's disinformation,
Right.
that's misinformation, and both sides are doing it right now. And I think that's the whole problem on social media when we're talking about this whole issue with Twitter files, misinformation, and whatnot, is that Dan brought it up. There's so much information out there, and I think what we need is an educated populace that can look at information and say, discern and say, like, well, that's BS. Okay, I can follow that. Or you start looking at the media sources that are legitimate. Don't just go for what you want to hear. You know, anyone can do that. I can, go to Celtics.com and say the Celtics are the best all the time, but then look and go, well, they lost last night in a game they should have won, right? So I think that's the real issue there, that as a public, we have to start educating ourselves and start being more discerning.
Yeah, it seems like it should be start being like a required course in like middle school to like how to read the news and verify information.
If you go on Apple News, right, you just pull it up. Think of all that. I don't even know what these news sources are, and they're all opinion based.
Yeah.
They're not factual. So you start looking for facts. Then if you want to read opinions, great, but go in there not just looking for yours. Look for both sides of an issue.
And there's a sense in which that's sort of speaks to a broader problem in society, right? That we, as a society, are gravitating toward headlines that reinforce our priors and avoid the things that kind of challenge our beliefs or make us feel uncomfortable. And it just means we're drifting toward an illiberal society. And it's not a good thing for a democracy that requires a well-informed public. That having been said, I think there's serious concerns with trying to regulate disinformation or misinformation because the regulators have their own biases, right? If you think back, so Thomas Kuhn wrote a foundational book called The Structures of Scientific Revolutions, which kind of explains how it is that scientific thinking evolves over time. And the way it happens is everybody believes that the sun goes around the earth, right? And then Copernicus comes up with this idea that maybe we all rotate the sun instead, and he's called wrong, right? He's finding flaws in the existing model and offering a hypothesis, an alternate hypothesis. That alternate hypothesis is disinformation to those who believe in the status quo. But over time, maybe you find more problems with the existing model and more support for the alternate hypothesis, and eventually scientific thinking flips, right? It's not without cost. Galileo was excommunicated for his disinformation for pushing Copernican theory, right? But if you don't allow that process to occur, you freeze your thinking. It's like sort of the height of hubris. So we've got it all figured out, and it can't possibly be that we're wrong on anything whatsoever. Sure. That's the death of sort of liberal growth.
Yeah, and is that just like the natural process? Is there any way as a society to speed that up, or it's kind of just that's the way it goes?
I think the trick for regulators and for policymakers is to make sure that the public square is available for that dialogue, right? That even at the cost of having sort of QAnon types at the fringes, right? You have to make room for viewpoints to be heard and battled out in the marketplace of ideas. I'm a big fan of that metaphor because that's how learning happens.
Yeah. Last question I wanted to ask before we wrap up. I appreciate you both being here today. There's one, I think it was one of the journalists, Matt Taibbi, right before he testified at Congress, released another one of these files. And, we've talked about Hunter Biden, but another storyline here is COVID and sort of vaccine hesitancy and things like that. Obviously, there's a lot of false information during the pandemic about vaccines and government's motives, things like that, all sorts of crazy stuff. But there are some things in there where you see, directives to limit information that might, I think the language was, promote vaccine hesitancy, which theoretically could include information that's true. There's certain risks and dangers to vaccines, and there were concerns about, well, these vaccines haven't been tested enough, which is all true per se. But you had that information being restricted because as the information from the Twitter files revealed, it promoted vaccine hesitancy. So Twitter goes in and removes some of that information. It seems like a pretty dangerous prospect to be going in and limiting speech in that type of context. Is there going back from this? Is this like muscle memory for these platforms now? And what does that say about what's going on in there as we move past the pandemic and these issues tend to hang around?
I'm glad you brought up the pandemic because I think, we went through this pandemic and you really saw in action, there was two sides of the fence and that was it. And people, if you questioned anything, like, hey, it was great if I went to a restaurant, I wore a mask, but when I sat down, I could take my mask off and magically I was fine and I could have a conversation as long as I'm drinking and eating, all is well. Everyone knew, okay, that's a workaround, but you play along with it. I think the good thing that, the pandemic is going to this issue is that everyone, and as Americans, we do it better than no one else, is we question government all the time. And I think people now are questioning not only government, but every news story that comes out in a good way. And I'm talking about like, the general populace, not the extreme left or the extreme right. And they're always going to be there. But people now are questioning. And that's what I think you want in a democracy, is that as a citizen, people are getting more active in government. They're more interested and they're more focused on their communities. And I think, okay, I have rose glasses on and I always see the better. And I think we're going to be in a better place in 5 years. We're getting through it. And hopefully we can fix this, but I don't think you're going to fix it from regulation. Again, I think you're going to fix it by education and being more discerning of the information that comes out.
Sure.
Yeah, and I just had, God bless the guys who were the folks who were in power at the time, making the best decisions they could in an unprecedented pandemic.
Right.
I believe they were making their decisions in good faith based on the best information they have possible, but it's not a surprise that with hindsight, many of those decisions turned out to be wrong. And that's going to happen, right, when you're making decisions based on imperfect information under time pressure. And so making space for those dissenting viewpoints to at least be heard, be logged, to continue informing the ongoing dialogue about how our scientific understanding of this pandemic evolved is important. And in a sense, I think it was a mistake for the government to push and for social media companies to accede in preventing those alternative viewpoints from being heard.
Sure. Well, professors, thank you both for coming in. This has been
Thank
BC
you.
Law's Just Law
Thank you.
podcast. I'm Tom Blakely. We've been talking about the Twitter files with Professors Daniel Lyons and Kevin Powers. Until next time, that'll do it. Thanks for tuning in.